entrepreneurial spirit that this country is very good at.
John Penrose.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I guess the simplest way to greet this bill is with a massive cheer of hooray, because for many of us in this place today, we have been waiting and waiting and waiting for a very long time. And it's really good to see, A, it arriving on the floor of the House at last here, and also to see the fact that it is being welcomed from both sides, and there is cross-party agreement on the fact that it is due and past due, frankly, to plug some of those gaps. So great news that it is here, and for many, many of us, we've been pushing for a very long time to get things like beneficial ownership transparency, so that if you want to find out who owns a particular company, you don't have to go through multiple layers of shells and bits and pieces and finally end up in a secrecy jurisdiction. You are, at least in theory, able to find somebody who's in charge or exercising effective control over that company who's got a pulse. And that is the ultimate guarantee that we are getting somewhere. Now, we've already heard that there are many further steps that are going to be required in order to make that actually bite properly, but in principle, isn't it great that we are here? Isn't it great that this stuff is happening? And I'm delighted to be able to welcome it along with everybody else here today. You can probably tell, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I'm working up to a but at the end of that sentence. And in fact, I'm working up to two buts, if I can. The first of them is the point raised by my honourable friend from Thirsk and Malton about failure to prevent, or indeed any other effective mechanism of ensuring that there is corporate, and I'm using corporate in the broadest sense, not just companies, but all corporate vehicles, so that includes things like trusts as well, that there is some sort of proper personal liability for the people who are running these corporate vehicles if they allow things like money laundering to happen. Failure to prevent is probably the most obvious way to do it, and it was blessed and agreed to for fraud as an extension of where we are now by the Law Commission in its recently published report. But there's a whole range of other kinds of crime and economic crime which it didn't cover, and they said there may be other mechanisms other than failure to prevent, but it doesn't really matter what that mechanism is. It's got to be better than what we have at the moment, and we absolutely have to push forward on this. This is one of the biggest remaining holes in our coverage, in our protections, and until we do this, my honourable friend is quite right, until we plug this particular gap, we will end up still with a huge amount of opportunity for thieves and kleptocrats and organised crime, criminals of all kinds to do what they do. And they are incredibly, I'm afraid, incredibly entrepreneurial people. They are very creative. They stay ahead of whatever mechanisms we come up with. And it's only by doing something like that that we will close that gap properly and get an all-encompassing roadblock to what they do. And so therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's absolutely essential that whether it is failure to prevent or some other mechanism, we cannot accept that the status quo is adequate in this area. And we must, all of us, on all sides of the House, send a resounding message to ministers and to law enforcement that this must not be allowed to persist. I think, I may be being a little bit over-optimistic, but I think we heard from the Home Secretary earlier on. She said that, that the government plans to come back and look at and take forward, I think was the phrase she used, the report from the Law Commission. I hope that she will hear from all of us here that is good news, but we would like to take it forward briskly, promptly, and with maximum energy, if we can. The second point, the second but, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the point about enforcement. Because it's all very well to have brilliant legal structures, brilliant laws passed and regulations in place which says thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that, but it's no flipping use at all if there's no one there to actually police it and enforce it. And while there are an awful lot of people working extremely hard in all sorts of organisations like the National Crime Agency and others, in order to try and do this enforcement, we all know that there's an enforcement gap in this country compared to, for example, America, where they are an awful lot better at it, in this particular area at least, than we are. And so therefore, we're going to have to raise our game here, and I wish that there was a Home Office Minister on the bench sitting alongside the excellent Minister from Bays at this moment, because the Home Office is going to be the department which is going to be under funding pressure to raise the game in order to make sure there are enough resources for these enforcement organisations to do their job and to do it better and more effectively and more efficiently than they are at the moment. And until they do that, we are always going to be internationally a weak link. And I don't think we should kid ourselves about where we are at the moment. We are a bit of a weak link at the moment. But, and this brings me on to the other half of this point about enforcement, Madam Deputy Speaker, points made by my honourable friend from Cheadle about the APPG chair about whistleblowing really matter. As the point I made to the Shadow Home Secretary earlier on, we can turbocharge and maximise the effectiveness of our existing enforcement organisations if we get our whistleblowing regime upgraded and improved very dramatically from where it is now, because whistleblowers are force multipliers for police. They make the police's life easier, they bring them really good, warm leads, they blow open cases, they provide the evidence that are needed to create to create effective prosecutions. Without them, the job is a great deal more expensive and a great deal less effective. With them, they can do their job much faster, much better, and frankly, the kleptocrats, the oligarchs, and the various different crime lords are a great deal more scared of the UK with a decent whistleblowing regime than they are without one. Now, that causes a problem because ministers will say, yes, but there isn't enough space in this bill in order to get upgrades to the whistleblowing regime. I think many of us have asked that question before we got here today, and we all had the same answer, which is, yes, it's very, very important, but not here, not now, not just yet. I don't think that's going to be good enough, frankly. I don't think that's going to be adequate. I appreciate that the constraint on space is real. I'm not trying to pretend it isn't. But there are a series of other things which ministers could do which don't require this bill, which could be done through, for example, little bits of secondary legislation, and which, if they make the commitment to do them, ideally in the ministers' summing up later on this afternoon, or certainly in the committee stage of this bill, if they will make those commitments, then the pressure for primary legislation and for, dare I say it, endless rounds of suggested amendments, which people might possibly be minded to table in this area later on in the progress of this bill, either here or at the other end of the building, will be greatly reduced. So it's in everybody's interests for ministers to say, yep, we're going to do them. And there are just 4 things which, if the minister is able to stand up later on this afternoon and say, yes, we'll do these during the course sometime of this particular parliamentary session, an awful lot of the pressure in this area will be able to be relieved, because we will all know that there will be proper progress to be made. Just very quickly, Madam Deputy Speaker, the things which would reduce the pressure and reduce the need for primary legislation on this in this bill are very simple. Firstly, we could extend the Prescribed Persons Order 2014 to include all the professional regulators. At the moment it includes some of them, but the point about the professional regulators is if you include all of them, then it massively improves the protection available to whistleblowers. So when somebody stands up and says, I have seen something that's wrong, this needs to be dealt with, I'm going to blow the whistle, I'm going to provide the information. They are not the ones who end up being the victims. They are not the ones who end up unemployable. They are not the ones who end up being completely monstered either by their former employer or by the profession in which they work, because the extending the Prescribed Persons Order means that those professional regulators then have a duty to look after them. At the moment, there are big gaps in that list. It's a relatively straightforward, doesn't require primary legislation step to plug those gaps. Why on earth aren't we doing it? Why can't we do it now? It only takes secondary legislation. Let's get on and do it. Second one is expanding the definition of a worker under the existing regulations. At the moment, it's fine if you are an employee. Well, it's not fine, but you are better protected if you are an employee and you blow the whistle. But if you are a trainee, a non-executive director, a supplier, one of those sorts of people who is very, very well placed to see wrongdoing, may very well know what's going on and have very good audit trail evidence to provide. But if you do, in those situations, woe beside you, because you ain't protected as you should be and as you would be if you are an ordinary employee. That seems to me, and it seems to an awful lot of people, to be jolly silly and a massive gap, and it's again easy enough to fix.
He's making a fantastic speech, and on that particular issue I quoted talked about my constituent Ian Foxley. He was a contractor working overseas, Those kind of people are not covered by the existing legislation. Had they been, he would have been able to seek redress through that company he worked for. As it is, he cannot.
Absolutely right, and a very good example. And again, it's relatively simple to fix. It doesn't require primary legislation. It would reduce the pressure on this bill. It would reduce the pressure from all of us here trying to shoehorn extra things into this bill. And in the interests of giving the Minister an easy time, which of course we all want to do, if he can just make this commitment for some time in this parliamentary session, then it all goes away. And it will just be an awful lot better. We will end up with something quicker and better very easily indeed. Third point, money laundering regulations. Again, there are a series of those which can be upgraded and improved. Again, it doesn't take primary legislation. Again, it will help dramatically. And final point will be simply to improve the way that the process works for raising concerns. Lots of other countries have online systems with websites that work easily, and they are centralised. And if you know that if you do it through that centralised system, you automatically are engaged with the necessary protections, and you automatically have the right degree of protection, so you are much more comfortable that you aren't going to be the one who ends up on the receiving end of victimisation from the people who you are trying to blow the whistle about. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, 4 items, easy for the Minister to say, nice and simple, and not only that, he will have, I'm sure, the support of his Home Office counterparts, because they are going to be the ones whose budgets are going to be under pressure to improve and upgrade the resources available to the investigative organisations like the National Crime NCA, who will otherwise have to be paid more money in order to do this. They'll still need a bit, but they will be much more effectively able to use it if we can just make these 4 things. I hope this is helpful. I look forward to the Minister's comments, and I will have my pen poised to be able to tick these off, and I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to be helpful.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Weston-super-Mare, who I know has championed many of these things for an incredibly long time, among so many on these benches, and it's always an honour to be in these debates, because it really does feel like it's Parliament pushing government